Hello, I'm Jay Shabler. Our first report from 1998 probes the mind of a most unlikely killer. Before headlines told the story of how he had taken a young girl's life, Jeremy Strohmeyer was known only as a popular high school honor student.
Even in the middle of the night, the flashing lights of the Las Vegas casinos shined as brightly as ever. Inside, serious gamblers hardly notice the hour. The game is everything. Leroy Iverson liked the slot machines, and though his daughter Cherise was only 7, he would often bring her along. She would play, while he gambled into the wee hours. On Memorial Day weekend, Iverson brought Cherise to the Prima Donna Casino, and once again, she was left on her own. Security cameras captured Cherise playing what appeared to be a game of hide-and-seek with a stranger, a young man. No one knew it yet, but this was her last hour alive. At 3:48 a.m., Cherise is seen darting into the woman's bathroom. Seconds later, the young man she'd been playing with follows. Just after 5 o'clock in the morning, Cherise's body was discovered, half naked on a toilet seat. She had been sexually molested and strangled to death. Hundreds came to mourn the happy little girl who died so horribly. Family and friends were overwhelmed with grief and shock. By the time Cherise was buried, police already had their man.
He was supposed to go to his senior prom tonight.
Instead, 18-year-old Jeremy Strohmeyer was arrested for first-degree murder. Those who knew him were dumbfounded. Just 6 months before the crime, Jeremy Strohmeyer had been an honor student, a dedicated athlete, with loving parents, a stable home, and a good neighborhood. But now, Jeremy Strohmeyer is a convicted murderer. To the world, he is a pariah. Hello, Jeremy.
Hello.
In person, there is nothing threatening about him. We met a slender, polite, well-spoken young man at the Las Vegas County Detention Center, where he was waiting to be transferred to a state prison. Jeremy, you know that there are people who think that you are a monster.
Yes. People want to believe that I'm a monster because that's easy. They don't want to believe that I'm the same as their own son or their own brother.
Indeed, is that possible? Was this convict once a normal teenager? Could this crime have been avoided? Is there anything to be learned? We start at the beginning, at 18 months old, when Jeremy was adopted by John and Winnie Strohmeyer. They already had a biological daughter, Heather, but they wanted to adopt a so-called hard-to-place child, one who might otherwise be unwanted. When the adoption agency offered them Jeremy, they were thrilled.
He was very lively, very active, so loving.
What, if anything, were you told about Jeremy's biological parents, his birth mother and father?
We were told that his mother had some problems with drugs and that she wasn't taking him during the time she gave birth to Jeremy.
What they did not know, and would not know until after their son's arrest, was that Jeremy's birth mother had been forcibly committed to a mental institution. She was schizophrenic and severely addicted to drugs and alcohol. Jeremy's biological father had also been on drugs. Winnie and John had no idea what genetic risk factors their new son might have inherited. They never knew what signs to look out for. And as Jeremy grew up, there were no signs. He got good grades, he played sports, he had good friends and girlfriends.
Looking good, Jeremy. You got a little smile. Don't be afraid.
What went wrong?
A lot of things.
Jeremy was always concerned about being adopted.
Sometimes I felt that I was going crazy. Nobody understood me. I felt outside that I'd see things in a certain way, but nobody else could see it the same way I did.
You didn't tell your parents?
No.
In high school, Jeremy says he began to use alcohol. At first, just at parties, but by his senior year, he depended on it.
It felt good. Everything seemed to fall into place.
And Jeremy began to take drugs, methamphetamines, also known as speed. Jeremy was about 16 or 17 when you began to notice problems?
Yes. I noticed that he spent more time by himself. He started to withdraw.
What did you think was happening?
It looked a lot like teenage-itis.
He's been coming home late, and his studies, where he's very focused, started to fall off.
You thought it was adolescent rebellion.
Assertion of independence.
But unbeknownst to his parents, Jeremy was already acting out. He became friendly with a classmate named David Cash, and together they were a dangerous combination.
I would become a real jerk.
Well, worse than that, friends later say that they were prostitutes that you would pick up and drag as you were driving your car.
When I was drunk, Dave would say, hey, grab her purse, grab her purse, let's go, and we'll grab her purse and take off.
Were you afraid yourself? Did you know what was happening to you?
I thought I could handle it.
When he was home and high on speed, Jeremy says he would stay up all night fiddling on his computer. After his arrest, police confiscated many files containing pornography on that computer. Some of the pictures were of little girls. Jeremy says now that they were sent unsolicited by email, but he did look at them. Are you a pedophile? I think that's the question people want to know.
No. I have no interest in sexual activities with children.
The Strohmeyers say they first became concerned that Jeremy was having serious trouble when he was arrested for drunk driving, but they never knew he was on drugs. Did you ever have any sign that he could be violent?
Violent? No. There was one evening he came home, he had been drinking, and he was quite agitated. And it was the first time he ever talked about, I'm screwed up, you don't understand, and we got an insight that he's having all kinds of blackouts.
He was outwardly saying, I'm going crazy. Yeah. I feel like I'm going crazy.
They did what they could. They took me to see a counselor, and that counselor misdiagnosed me as being having ADD.
Attention deficit disorder.
Right.
Jeremy was referred to a psychiatrist who, based on the counselor's recommendation, prescribed dexedrine and amphetamine. So now, in addition to his illegal speed, Jeremy had a perfectly legal supply of uppers. This was 1 week before he murdered a 7-year-old child.
Jeremy Strohmeyer acknowledged that his life was spinning out of control. But what pushed him to murder a 7-year-old girl? Strohmeyer himself has struggled to understand what happened during that fateful weekend with his friend David Cash.
Jeremy, let's go to the night of the murder. David Cash's father asks you to come along with his son for a weekend in Nevada. You go to the Prima Donna Casino in Nevada. Had you been drinking that night?
4 to 6 beers. Some whiskey and Coke.
Were you on drugs that night?
Yes, I was coming down from my speed. I had run out the day before, or that day, and so I was taking dexedrine.
Which had been prescribed for you.
Right.
Security cameras recorded Jeremy Strohmeyer and David Cash at 2 of the casinos in Prim, Nevada that night, wandering around and playing video games. At the Prima Donna, Jeremy is spotted playing with Cherise Iverson and following her into the bathroom. Were you thinking then at all of molesting this child?
No.
Why did you go into the bathroom? You just did.
It's part of the game, just...
Chasing her?
Yeah.
Okay, you go into the bathroom, ladies' room, you follow this child in. What happened?
She was standing there. I thought she was getting ready to throw something at me, and she ended up swinging a sign at me, a wet floor sign, and it hit me. And I remember at that point, for no reason, just being enraged, just being filled with rage. And I grabbed her. But I don't remember what happened after that.
Jeremy Strohmeyer says he doesn't remember now, but 4 days after the murder, he gave police graphic details about everything that happened during the attack on Charisse, including the fact that he had sexually fondled her. Police recorded his confession on audio tape.
Took off her boots and her pants and her underwear. And, she was quiet. I choked her, started choking her.
You don't remember molesting her?
No. I got so scared. I panicked. I'm suddenly standing there. I'm looking at this little girl, and she's dying, and she's in pain, and I'm the only one there. So in my mind, it must have been me that did this. So all I could think was to get out of there, to just get away. So I tried to stop her pain, and I got out of there as quick as I could, and I just...
You tried to stop her pain by twisting and breaking her neck.
Yes.
Do you remember that?
Yes. Seemed like she was suffering so much.
You killed her to stop her suffering? Or because you were afraid that you'd be found out?
I thought I didn't know what I was thinking.
Strohmeyer's friend, David Cash, had also been in the bathroom that night. He says he tried to get Jeremy's attention to stop the attack. Could David Cash have stopped you, do you think, if he'd really wanted to?
Oh yeah, he outweighed me. He was bigger than me, stronger than me.
But David Cash did not stop Strohmeyer. Instead, he walked out of the bathroom.
When I came out and Dave Cash was there, he told me, you were molesting her. Not in those words, but...
David Cash, Jeremy says, filled in the details for the confession he later gave to the police. Do you think that David Cash should be charged as an accessory to the murder?
Yes.
Nevada authorities disagreed, even though Cash helped conceal the crime by keeping it from police for days. Even if Cash saw Jeremy actually molesting Charisse, as Jeremy now says Cash did, he broke no laws. David Cash and Jeremy Strohmeyer spent the rest of the weekend gambling and hanging out in Las Vegas before going home to California. The Strohmeyers say when their son returned, they didn't notice any change in his behavior. But 4 days later, classmates identified Strohmeyer as the man on the videotape, and police swooped down for the arrest. The Strohmeyers were devastated. And there was more to the nightmare. After their son's arrest, the Strohmeyers finally learned what they feel they should have known from the beginning. What they say would have given them the edge they needed to save their son. Adoption files obtained by Jeremy's lawyers clearly stated that Jeremy's birth mother was schizophrenic, and they learned she had been committed 18 times before Jeremy was born. She was so deeply addicted to drugs and alcohol that she was declared incapable of caring for herself. Jeremy shows no sign of mental illness, but the Strohmeyers feel he clearly inherited a vulnerability to addictions.
I believe in my heart, had Jeremy gotten the right help, had we gotten the right help, had we known more about his background, to get that kind of help, we wouldn't be here today.
Is there anything to be learned from this tragedy? Is there anything that you might want to say to other parents?
Yes. I think the first thing is that parents shouldn't assume they know their children. But we have to be extremely proactive in keeping our ear to the ground and listening and seeing any signs, because there's so many things out there today that could derail our children.
In June 1999, the state of Nevada passed a law that would make it a crime for adults who witnessed child abuse to fail to contact authorities. The law was named for Charisse Iverson and was prompted by the failure of David Cash to intervene after he witnessed part of Strohmeyer's attack on the little girl. In September 1998, after a surprise plea bargain just hours before his trial was to start, Strohmeyer stood before the court with his lawyer, Leslie Abramson. and pleaded guilty to all charges: kidnapping, sexual assault of a child, and murder. In order to avoid the death penalty, he agreed to life in prison with no chance of parole.
Do you understand that without the possibility of parole means just what it says?
Yes, sir.
You have to spend the rest of your natural life in prison.
Yes, sir. I'm damned in my own mind. I'm never going to be able to escape the fact that I did this. And every day it hurts.
At the time of his sentencing, Strohmeyer addressed the court.
I'm not seeking sympathy or forgiveness or a lessening of my own guilt. I'm not a monster, a pedophile, a delinquent, a sociopath. I was not a predator waiting to snatch this child from her family. I was a high-performing, likable kid with a bright future, a sense of duty, and a sense of honor.
Strohmeyer offered advice to parents who might have a troubled child.
Watch your children. Talk to your children. As far as adoptions go, the adoption agencies should let the information be known. The whole history of what you are, who you are. I am going away to prison for the rest of my life, and that is only fair because I took Sharice's life away from her, then my life be taken away from me.
In October 1998, Jeremy Strohmeyer was transferred to a maximum security prison in Nevada, where, for his own protection, he was segregated from the general population. Our next report from 1994 tells the story of a troubled man and the woman he took hostage. The wrinkle here is that when Eve Taylor faced her assailant, Donald Cates, she was specially prepared for the crisis.
The peaceful calm amidst the woods of Durham, North Carolina, can be soothing, comforting, safe, but they can also be terrifying. This is the story of one woman who confronted a confused and desperate man.
I know this was going to be the last day for me.
And how she faced a moment of crisis in her home.
I assumed it was going to be the last day of my life.
It was a routine police call involving a suspected stolen car in April of 1993, which led Officer Leroy Williams on the chase of a suspect who suddenly confronted him with a shotgun.
Once I saw the shotgun, I immediately drew my .45 automatic and pointed it at the subject and told him to stop.
At the dramatic moment of face down, the armed suspect suddenly turned and fled into the woods, eventually reaching a nearby house where a college professor, Eve Taylor, was working alone.
I heard gunshots and heard police sirens, and then there was this crashing sound at the front door.
She faced stark terror with no escape and no one to turn to for help. In an instant, she was confronted by a fugitive fleeing a police manhunt.
Am I going to be shot? Am I going to be beaten? Am I going to be tortured? Am I going to be raped? I've never felt that level of terror, ever.
Gripping a 12-gauge shotgun was Donald Cates, crazed, confused, and suicidal.
All I was thinking about was, I got to do this. I got to do this. I mean, I can't take none of this no more.
Anyone's natural reaction to fight or flee. But Eve Taylor was different. She was a psychologist with a specialty in violence and anger. Eve concluded her best hope for survival was to try to talk her way out of it. First, she had to understand him.
When he said, I'm not going to hurt you, I only want to hurt myself, then I asked, well, why? What's gone so wrong that you feel that that's the only way out?
Eve Taylor's bid for survival unfolded as she tried to psychologically outmaneuver her intruder.
I asked him, what can we do to get you out of this predicament? And he said, do you have any alcohol? I want a drink.
She poured the drink using as little alcohol as possible, realizing his drinking would increase her danger.
I started asking him what was it that he was so distraught about, and he was separated from his wife, and they were talking about a divorce, and he didn't want that, and he had been feeling very sad and wanting to kill himself for some time, and decided that it was time to do it.
I had come to a conclusion in my mind. Why should I just keep living like this?
Her logic came straight out of the textbook.
And start talking to him more about suicide within a family, when you have depression in a family, that it can be genetically inherited by a number of family members. And he says that that's true, that there were other family members that also had depression.
The state of terror in the house had been going on for more than 30 minutes, but police still didn't know where Cates was hiding. And tension heightened even more when the telephone rang.
I was still in the stance that I was a captive. I mean, every time I moved, I told him that I'm getting more comfortable, or I'm going to the kitchen to get water, whatever. I announced every move that I made. So when the phone rang, I said, well, that's all right, I'll just let it ring. And he says, well, you can answer it if you want.
It was a neighbor who was alarmed because he had seen police activity elsewhere in the area. When he found Eve was not alone, he called the police. The crisis intensified even more as heavily armed police snipers filled the woods outside her door. Now Cates was the potential target of sharpshooters, and she was in the line of fire. There was now no way out short of negotiation or death.
And I told him, if it was meant for you to die today, you wouldn't have found this house, that you wouldn't have met me, that I wouldn't be so adamantly standing in your way if it was meant to happen today. So it was a matter of changing his way of thinking about himself and about the situation.
The confrontation had dragged on for 5 hours. Time now became the enemy.
Was there something she said or did, or was there a point at which you said, change my mind, I will do it?
Yeah, she said, Donald, I'll help you make it through this. I had to have trust in somebody.
As a result of that trust, Eve was able to get Donald to come out with her.
I had told Donald that I would not leave until he was safely in the police car, that was a promise that I had made to him. And once he was handcuffed and put in the police car, then I said goodbye.
Remarkably, Eve Taylor had gone from a terrorized victim to a detached analyst in order to survive, and unknowingly to an emotional participant in a despondent man's life.
The conversation and the talk that we had, it somewhat brought me back to reality.
In court, she helped convince the judge to show leniency. Cates received a 10-year prison sentence, but with time served and community service, his time in jail would be brief.
But when I had lost trust in people, I could gain back in her.
Looking for the good in other people can pay off, even when you're faced with the very negative parts, the very dark side of other people.
In 1999, 6 years after the extraordinary encounter between Eve Taylor and Donald Cates, Taylor no longer thought about the fear she experienced during those terrifying 5 hours.
When I look back, I see it as actually one of the more positive experiences I've ever had in my life. It's a situation that started out very bad and really couldn't have ended any better than it did. And I think it was a situation that brought out the best in me, and I think it actually brought the best out in Donald also.
The two spoke regularly for several years after Donald Cates was released from prison.
He had a steady job. He was establishing friendships that seemed to be working well for him. And then he started moving from one job to the next, and the times he spent at the subsequent jobs, the time tended to be shorter.
Cates was fighting a constant battle with depression and often entertained thoughts of taking his own life.
He promised me, and it was a promise that he initiated and he seemed to need to make to me, is that he would be in regular contact with me and that I would always know where he was and how he was doing. And he promised me that if he ever started to slip down into a depression, that he would call me before he thought about killing himself. And he did do that on a regular basis for several years. But then there was one time that he slipped into a depression that he didn't call me. And at that time, he was successful in committing suicide.
Cates's body was found in a pickup truck he had used to poison himself with carbon monoxide gas.
I knew that there were aspects of his life that were not going smoothly, but that seemed to often be the case with Donald. So while I was distressed to hear that he had killed himself, I can't say that I was surprised.
In 1998, Eve Taylor and her family moved to New Orleans, where she took a job on the faculty of Louisiana State University. Though tragic, her extraordinary friendship with Donald Cates had inspired an enduring sense of optimism.
It's reaffirmed for me that you can connect with people very different from yourself, that you think you have absolutely nothing in common with, that you may even perceive as your enemy, and end up developing a very positive, hopeful relationship.
When an accused criminal claims amnesia, it can't help but arouse suspicion. But our next story from 1998 reports on a man who made that claim and stood by it. The journey for the truth takes us deep into Pat Brown's mind.
Pat Brown says the first recollection of his new life was waking up in a ditch alongside Interstate 80 just outside Cheyenne, Wyoming on July 13th, 1994. He told us he had lumps on the back of his head, bruises on his elbows, and a giant headache. And he claims a hitchhiker shook him out of unconsciousness and said he was mumbling the names Pat, Chris, and Joel.
I finally came around without any ID. I woke up with 23 cents in a comb.
Disoriented and hungry, he says he walked into a Cheyenne homeless shelter. At that precise moment, Pat Brown was born.
They asked my name, and I said Pat, and the color of the desk he was sitting at was brown, so...
Why'd you say Pat?
Because that was one of the names that I was mumbling when I woke up.
Pat stayed at the shelter for about a week. Ignorant even of his own skills, he says he got up every morning and searched for work. But without a social security number or any identification that would help him get one, he found himself unemployable. So Pat Brown hit the road. For 5 days, he walked or hitchhiked and slept by the side of the road, winding up 450 miles away here in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. He'd heard that local construction companies were hiring day laborers, which means he didn't need any ID. This is where he began his new life. Pat found permanent work at a newspaper, the Jackson Hole Guide, where he learned to become a pressman.
Well, how's it look?
He says little pieces of the puzzle started to flash into his consciousness. Unfocused images that might help solve the mystery of his real identity. General outlines of Chicago somehow seemed familiar. Could that be home? Who were his parents? Pat, Chris, Joel, the names he called out that first day in the ditch. Could they be his family? The slivers of memory were unclear and random. He tried to impose some reason himself, appealing to the Jackson Hole police for help in retrieving his real life. They'd never dealt with amnesia before and had some doubts about Pat's story. But they submitted his fingerprints to the FBI, who ran them through their criminal, civil, missing persons, and their dead files. No match was found. Pat Brown was still a man without a past. Eventually, Pat joined a local Catholic church because somehow being there felt good. Amazingly, he kept his amnesia a secret from everyone for 3.5 years, unsure that he'd be understood or believed. Even the choir director, Michelle Doyle, the person who'd become his best friend, didn't find out until Pat finally confided in her.
As I was listening to him and watching his eyes, I knew he was very serious. And the more questions I asked, the more I became convinced.
A hitchhiker found him.
With the help of Michelle, who had become like a sister, Pat contacted the syndicated television show Unsolved Mysteries.
Tonight, Pat needs your help to find out who he really is.
It was a moment fraught with promise. Would this be another dead end? Or might Pat Brown finally rediscover his true identity?
Dad, Mom and Chris need you. I think Chris is hurt.
Recently, as they watched a tape of the segment, he and Michelle relived the overwhelming release they'd felt when the telephone rang after the show. It was a call that would change Pat Brown's life forever.
We found his wife and his kids. We know everything. She's been looking for him for 5 years.
After nearly 4 years of a life with no past, Pat Brown's mystery appeared to be solved. He had a wife, Pat Brodnick, who'd been searching for him under his real name, Carl Brodnick, ever since he disappeared from their home in Indianapolis.
I never gave up hope that someday he'd be found and he'd come back home.
But the reemergence of Carl Brodnick stirred more than just his own family. It turns out that detectives in Indianapolis had also been searching for him.
God, I missed you.
And the publicity over his story led them to their man.
Mr. Brodnick is charged with 6 counts of theft. He, over a period of time, misappropriated funds totaling almost $25,000.
Scott Newman is the Marion County prosecutor, and he says Carl embezzled that money while he was the comptroller of a small Indianapolis advertising agency. It is alleged that over the course of 13 months, Carl filled in his own name on these unauthorized company checks after he had them endorsed by company officers, and that he used nearly $8,000 of the stolen money to have improvements made to his home. It is also alleged that on Saturday, July 9th, 1994, Carl found out the police were closing in on him, and he fled Indianapolis to avoid arrest.
He knew he'd been found out, and there was nothing amnesic about the fact that he got the heck out of Indianapolis, Indiana.
Carl's story, as you'll recall, is that 4 days later he was found in that Wyoming ditch with no recollection of what got him there.
There are people who are saying you're lying about the amnesia.
Well,
that this is all a big cover-up because you didn't want to have to face the accusations.
If it was a big cover-up, why go on national TV?
Because that creates a very believable alibi.
You've thought about it. What do you think he's doing?
I think that he may have committed the perfect crime.
A few days after their family reunion, Carl Brodnick came back to Indianapolis, where he is accused of that crime. He presented himself to the court and was released on a $3,500 bond.
You remember any of this? No?
No.
Then Carl went home to try to recapture his past. But even as he toured the house he'd not seen for nearly 4 years, there was yet another surprise, that while he traveled from Cheyenne to Jackson Hole, Carl had stopped in a small town called Riverton and checked into a shelter late at night. We have obtained this copy of his guest registration form, dated July 21st, 1994, just 8 days after he claims he was found in a ditch, beaten and without any memory. But contrary to what he told us about his amnesia, Carl filled out this form with his correct Social Security number, his correct date and place of birth, and even said he had 2 children. Most damning of all, the man who had recreated himself as Pat Brown signed his name as Carl Brodnick.
Carl, what does this mean?
I don't know.
Did you do this?
That they say that looks like my signature. So I must have done it. I don't remember answering any questions or signing anything. The only thing I can think of is when that was while I was walking to Jackson. It might have been real late, and I'd been walking all day, and I was real tired.
So you think if you did this, it was in a state of fatigue?
Yeah.
You had no idea, and you never remembered it the next day?
Right.
Does it look like your signature to you?
I don't know. I don't have any old signatures.
There's nothing in this house that has an old signature of yours on it?
Well, I haven't looked. I don't have a copy of that to compare it to.
What's your lawyer's attitude towards this?
She says it really damages my credibility.
What do you think?
It definitely does.
People are going to watch this and say, the guy's a liar.
Yeah.
He did it.
Yeah.
And the others are going to say, I don't know. What do you want them to think about this?
I don't know that I can really influence them one way or another. All I can tell them is what I know.
And you still insist you have no recollection of any of this?
No.
None?
No.
Brodnick pleaded guilty to one count of theft, though he still maintained he had no memory of the crime. In May 1999, he was sentenced to 100 days of home detention, plus a year of probation. He has made full restitution of more than $23,000. Memory is often the critical factor in courtroom testimony. As experts learn more and more about how the mind works, courts face new dilemmas about how to evaluate what witnesses say they remember.
I remember him, I was on a bed and there was a white sheet over the mattress, and my father was on top of me.
In 1994, Gary Ramona filed an $8 million malpractice suit against two therapists who had treated his daughter. His claim, they had deluded the 23-year-old into believing he had raped her as a child.
Sodium amytal, suggestions were made to her that she'd been sexually abused.
The therapist said they merely helped Holly Ramona recover a repressed memory. Her father called it a false memory, implanted by the therapist during a session using sodium amytal, or so-called truth serum. There is considerable debate about the practice in psychiatric circles.
To accuse someone with only a recovered memory or only something that's gained through sodium amytal, I think is not scientifically valid.
After he was accused by his daughter, Ramona became estranged from his wife and children and was fired from his $400,000 a year job as a winery executive.
Somebody has to stand up to the type of incompetence and how they destroyed a beautiful family.
But the psychiatrist Ramona sued said the lawsuit was just another attempt to manipulate and control his daughter.
She expressed fear to me that there would be retaliation from her father should she even describe to me her problems.
The jury sided with Gary Ramona, awarding him $500,000 in damages.
The money was not the issue, so I'm thankful to God and to friends who supported me. It's a very lonely, lonely road.
Some therapists worried that the case would have a chilling effect on their profession.
Therapists are going to have to be very careful about how they question their patients. They're going to have to think first about using things like hypnosis or amytal.
Holly's therapist said the real losers in this case are victims of sexual abuse.
This puts the patient in the position of, can I tell anybody what really happened?
As in the Ramona trial, the complexities of the human mind were at the heart of the case of Colin Ferguson. In Ferguson's case, it was a question of an accused killer's competence, both to stand trial and to defend himself. 6 people died in a December 1993 shooting spree on the Long Island Railroad, and 19 others were wounded. A man carrying notes in his pockets suggesting hatred of whites was taken away in handcuffs after other passengers wrested a gun out of his hands. That was Colin Ferguson.
I believe that I can prove my innocence. I believe that I can be acquitted. And I believe that I can do a better job than just about anyone else.
He was judged competent to stand trial, but when his lawyers recommended that he plead guilty by reason of insanity, he fired them, choosing instead to represent himself. The 1995 trial caused many to question Ferguson's sanity.
The evidence will show that Colin Ferguson was in fact a well-meaning passenger on the train. And also a well-meaning passenger transporting to Safe Haven a firearm, which in fact he purchased legally. There were 93 counts to that indictment. 93 counts, only because it matches the year 1993.
If Colin Ferguson was mad, as his former lawyers claimed, it was not a raving, violent madness, at least not in the courtroom.
On that matter, Judge, I am requesting an opportunity for several reasons which I can give to you.
Well-mannered most of the time, weighing everything he said with deadly earnestness, sometimes he even sounded like a lawyer.
Excuse me, Judge, objection. After what event? And you're on the oath, am I correct?
Yes.
Judge, could you admonish the witness to answer the question? I asked him a simple question. And Judge, the prejudicial effect of those photographs exceed their probative value. At the time that you were shot, Mr. Casaza,
At the trial, Ferguson cross-examined some of the victims face-to-face, people he was accused of shooting.
I saw a man get up. I looked over, looked me dead in the eyes, and shot me. Point blank right in the chest.
Upon hearing gunshots, I saw you coming up the aisle in what appeared to be a shooting position.
Ferguson's former attorney called it the trial of a madman.
What we are watching unfold is an obscene and a tragic spectacle. Perhaps we shouldn't be surprised. In a society that executes the mentally retarded, we allow an insane man to represent himself in a sham legal proceeding. But we should be ashamed of ourselves and be ashamed of what's happening here.
I don't categorize it as bizarre. The fact of the matter is, in this particular state, a defendant has the absolute right to defend himself as long as he's competent. The judge made a finding of competency indicating that Mr. Ferguson is competent.
In March 1995, after a 3-week trial, Colin Ferguson was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Every day, judges and juries make critical judgments about a defendant's state of mind. But is the courtroom the best place to explore the secrets of human psychology? Here's Professor Arthur Miller.
The law tries to reflect the value that we are not a mean, vindictive society. We want to hold people accountable for their acts, and we want to punish evildoers. But we don't want to punish someone for something he or she really is not responsible for. Very early on in the criminal law, we developed the notion that you would declare someone to be a criminal only if he understood the criminality of his actions. That's called mens rea, the evil intent. And by definition, someone who is insane, according to the law, doesn't have that. The psychiatrist says it's infinitely more complicated than the law makes it out to be. There are all sorts of mental illnesses, some of which might lead you to the conclusion of insanity, and others that might not. Psychiatrists say that the legal concept of insanity has no relevance to the psychiatric concept of insanity. And as mental health and psychiatry become more and more sophisticated, they overwhelm the law's ability to apply. That's because the law has crude tools and is always trying to catch up with science. And getting judges and juries to understand psychiatry and these gradations of mental illness, well, that's very tough business.
I'm Jay Shadler. Thanks for being with us. Join us again as we look behind the headlines at crime, punishment, and the law on the next edition of Justice Fund.